Krasnoyarsk, a quiet town in Sverdlovsk Oblast, Russia, is the kind of place where life moves slowly. Its streets wind past crumbling Soviet-era apartments, small shops and silent alleyways that echo with the distant laughter of children. But beneath the surface of its modest exteriors lies a town forever haunted by a sinister presence, a killer who preyed on its most vulnerable residents. From 2002 to 2010, a wave of brutal murders targeted elderly women across the region. The killings were sudden and violent, leaving the victims' homes as grotesque crime scenes drenched in blood and grief. The perpetrator? A seemingly ordinary woman named Irina Viktorovna Gaidamatchuk. By the time her crimes were uncovered, at least 17 lives had been claimed by her greed and monstrous depravity, earning her the chilling moniker the Satan in a skirt. Born in 1972 in the small town of Nyagin, Irina's early years were shaped by the shifting tides of Soviet Russia. Her family, like many others, lived under the weight of economic instability, struggling to make ends meet. Yet little in her childhood indicated the horrors that would one day come. By her teens, Irina had begun drinking heavily, a habit that would escalate and consume her. Alcohol became her escape from the monotony of life and the mounting pressures of adulthood. She married young and had 2 daughters, but her life in Krasnoyarsk, a town mired in economic despair, provided little solace. As her addiction worsened, so did her financial troubles. Irina's husband grew tired of her drinking and erratic behavior, and she faced constant criticism from her neighbors and family. Her need for money to fuel her addiction grew insatiable. It was this desperation, paired with her cold and calculating nature, that birthed a killer. Irina's killing spree began in 2002. Her first victim was an elderly widow, a woman living alone on a pension that barely sustained her. Posing as a social worker, Irina knocked on the woman's door, claiming she was there to discuss government benefits. The trusting woman allowed her inside a fatal mistake. Once the door closed, Irina struck with brutal efficiency. Armed with a hammer, she bludgeoned the woman to death. Blood splattered the walls as Irina ransacked the apartment, taking what little money she could find. The amount was meager, enough to buy alcohol for a few days, but the act itself gave Irina a sense of control she had never experienced before. The murder was shocking, but at the time authorities failed to connect it to a larger pattern. Deaths of elderly individuals, especially those living alone, were often dismissed as robberies gone wrong or accidents. Irina had learned something important: she could kill with impunity. Over the next 8 years, Irina perfected her method. She continued posing as a social worker, knocking on the doors of elderly women with promises of assistance or advice. Her victims, many of whom were lonely and isolated, welcomed her into their homes. Once inside, the pattern repeated. Irina would strike her victims with a hammer or axe, delivering fatal blows before looting their homes. The violence was savage and impersonal, suggesting a deep detachment from her victims. For Irina, they were not people, they were obstacles standing between her and the money she craved. Her murders were not random. Irina targeted women who were widows, aged between 61 and 89, and lived alone. Their vulnerability made them easy prey, and their modest pensions made them appealing targets. Irina's calculated approach was chilling in its efficiency, and her ability to blend in with the community allowed her to evade suspicion for years. As the body count grew, so did the fear in Krasnoyarsk and its surrounding areas. By 2005, rumors of a serial killer began to spread, though authorities were reluctant to confirm the existence of such a threat. Women, particularly the elderly, became prisoners in their own homes. Many stopped answering the door entirely, fearful that the next knock could be their last. Families took to checking in on their mothers and grandmothers daily, ensuring they were safe and warning them against trusting strangers. The press dubbed the killer Satan in a skirt, a name that captured the community's collective horror. The image of a woman, a caretaker, a nurturer, betraying that trust to commit such heinous acts was almost too much to comprehend. Despite the growing panic, police were slow to act. Resources were limited, and many officers dismissed the murders as unrelated crimes. It wasn't until forensic evidence began linking the case's traces of blood, similar patterns of entry, and consistent methods of killing that investigators realized they were dealing with a single predator. The police faced mounting pressure to solve the case, but Irina's ability to blend into her surroundings made her nearly invisible. She was an ordinary woman, unremarkable in appearance and demeanor, who moved through life unnoticed. Her victims, elderly women living on the margins of society, were equally overlooked. In 2010, a break in the case finally came. One of Irina's intended victims, suspicious of her claims to be a social worker, managed to escape and provide a detailed description to the police. Armed with this new information, investigators began narrowing their search. Irina's arrest in June 2010 shocked the community. Neighbors who had known her for years struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming woman with the monster who had committed such atrocities. During her interrogation, Irina confessed to the murders with a chilling lack of remorse. She described her crimes as if recounting a mundane task, speaking matter-of-factly about the lives she had taken. "I needed money," she said simply. It was the easiest way. Her confession revealed a mind devoid of empathy. She admitted that she felt no guilt for her actions, viewing her victims as little more than sources of income. She even expressed frustration at the small amounts of money she often found, lamenting the fact that her murders rarely yielded significant financial rewards. Irina's trial in 2012 was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers, all eager to see the woman behind the infamous crimes. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating killer who had exploited the trust of her victims. They described the brutality of her murders in graphic detail, forcing the court to confront the full extent of her savagery. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Irina's actions were driven by her alcoholism and desperation, attempting to portray her as a victim of circumstance. But the jury was unmoved. Irina was convicted of 17 murders and sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was far too lenient. Under Russian law, the maximum sentence for a woman is 20 years, regardless of the severity of her crimes. For the families of Irina's victims, her conviction brought little solace. Their loved ones were gone, their lives stolen by a woman who showed no remorse. Many struggled to move on, haunted by the knowledge that their mothers and grandmothers had died in terror and pain. The community of Krasnofimsk was left scarred by the ordeal. The trust that once defined its small-town life was shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Even years after Irina's arrest, elderly residents remained wary of strangers, their sense of security permanently eroded. Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk's crimes serve as a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight. She was not a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. She was a neighbor, a mother, a wife. Her ability to blend in allowed her to exploit the trust of her victims, turning her ordinary appearance into her most deadly weapon. Today, her name is spoken with fear and revulsion, a symbol of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most familiar faces. The victims she left behind, minus 17 women who had survived decades of hardship, are remembered not just for the way they died, but for the lives they lived. Their stories are a somber testament to the fragility of trust and the depths of human cruelty. As Irina serves out her sentence in a prison cell, the shadow of her crimes lingers, a dark stain on Krasnofimsk's history that will never fully fade. Irina's time in prison has done little to dull the horror of her reputation. Reports from the correctional facility where she serves her sentence describe her as unremarkable in demeanor, a woman who blends into the background as easily as she once did in Krasnofimsk. But beneath this facade lies a chilling truth: Irina has never expressed genuine remorse for her crimes. Fellow inmates and guards alike note her cold detachment. While some criminals wrestle with guilt or seek redemption, Irina remains indifferent. She avoids discussing her murders, dismissing questions about her victims with a shrug or a curt reply. To her, they were obstacles, tools in her pursuit of money and alcohol, nothing more. This lack of remorse has made her a figure of fascination among criminologists and psychologists. Studies conducted on Irina have attempted to uncover the root of her psychopathy. Was she born with a predisposition to violence, or did the harsh circumstances of her life warp her psyche beyond repair? While no definitive answers have emerged, many experts point to a combination of factors: a childhood marked by instability, a culture that devalued the elderly, and the numbing effects of addiction. Irina's case has become a grim example of how societal neglect and personal desperation can intersect to create a perfect storm of violence. For the families of Irina's victims, the pain of their loss remains a constant presence. Many struggle to reconcile the fact that their loved ones, women who had survived wars, famines, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, were taken not by illness or old age, but by the violent hands of a fellow citizen. Memorials to the victims have sprung up in Krasnoufimsk and neighboring towns. Small plaques, adorned with flowers and candles, mark the homes where lives were brutally ended. These makeshift shrines serve as a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of Irina's crimes. Some families have sought solace in activism, advocating for stronger protections for the elderly and greater awareness of the dangers posed by those who exploit their vulnerabilities. Others have turned inward, their grief too raw to share with the world. Even years after Irina's arrest, the people of Krasnoufimsk remain deeply affected by her actions. The once trusting community has grown wary and insular. The elderly, in particular, remain reluctant to open their doors to strangers, no matter how convincing their stories may seem. Local authorities have implemented new policies in response to the tragedy. Social workers are now required to carry identification and provide advance notice before visiting homes. Public awareness campaigns have been launched to educate residents about potential scams and dangers, though the memory of Irina's crimes serves as a far more potent warning than any government program could offer. The psychological impact on the town cannot be overstated. Krasnoufimsk, already struggling under the weight of economic hardship, now bears the additional burden of collective trauma. The scars left by Irina's reign of terror are not easily healed, and for many, the fear she instilled has become a permanent part of their lives. Irina's case has sparked broader discussions about the systemic issues that allowed her crimes to go unnoticed for so long. In a country where elderly citizens often live in isolation, relying on meager pensions and limited support, the vulnerabilities of this demographic have become glaringly apparent. Experts have criticized the initial police response to the murders, noting that a quicker recognition of the pattern could have saved lives. The lack of resources and training for local law enforcement, coupled with a dismissive attitude toward crimes against the elderly, created a perfect environment for a predator like Irina to thrive. Her case also highlights the stigma surrounding addiction and mental health in Russia. Irina's alcoholism was both a driving force behind her crimes and a symptom of deeper issues that went unaddressed. Had she received treatment or support earlier in life, could her descent into violence have been prevented? Irina's story has become a part of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered among residents and passed down to younger generations. Her name has become synonymous with betrayal and violence, a reminder that evil can wear a friendly face. For criminologists and true crime enthusiasts, Irina remains a figure of fascination. Her case is studied alongside other infamous female serial killers, her motives and methods dissected in an attempt to understand what drove her to commit such heinous acts. Yet, for the people of Krasnoufimsk, Irina is not a subject of academic interest or morbid curiosity. She is a living nightmare, a symbol of everything they have lost. As Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk sits in her prison cell, the world outside moves on. Her name may fade from headlines, but the pain she caused will linger for generations. The women she killed are not just statistics, they were mothers, grandmothers, and pillars of their communities. Their lives were rich with memories, laughter, and love, lives that were brutally cut short by a woman driven by greed and apathy. In Krasnoufimsk, life continues, but the shadow of Irina's crimes looms large. The streets, once filled with casual conversations and open doors, are now quieter, more guarded. The town, like its people, bears the scars of her betrayal, a reminder that trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Irina's story is one of darkness and despair, a chilling example of how the worst monsters are often those we least expect. But it is also a story of resilience of a community that, despite its pain, refuses to let her define them. And so, the memory of Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk remains, not as a tale of triumph or redemption, but as a stark warning. Even in the quietest corners of the world, evil can find a way in.